Kauai er den eldste av de store hawaiianske øyene, og er også en av de mest dramatiske. Skarpe vulkanske fjell og tåkekledde topper på opptil 1600 meter utgjør store deler av øya, og her finnes Waimea Canyon, som er Stillehavets største. Nordsiden av øyen er våt og tropisk, mens sør og sørvest er tørr og solfylt. Det er her den største delen av befolkningen samler seg. I dag er øyen et søvnig og landlig turiststed med en befolkning på 55 000 innbyggere, og landskapet, strendene, så vel som de historiske byene, er store attraksjoner. Kauai har gått gjennom dramatiske forandringer siden kaptein James Cook landet i Waimea i 1778, da han ankom Hawaii for første gang. Besøket resulterte i at Hawaii ble en del av en global verden, og deres tidligere lokale økonomier og sosiale systemer ble fortrengt av sosiale systemer som var globale og kapitalistiske. De gamle hawaiianske høvdingesystemer, derimot, formet seg etter modell av det britiske kongehus og nasjonalstat. På Hawaii var drivkraften bak de store sosiale og landskapsmessige forandringer på 1800-tallet sukkerindustrien. Jakten på sukker omformet land til plantasjer, og arbeidsbehovet førte til storstilt arbeidsmigrasjon. Mange av plantasjeeierne ble styrtrike og mektige, blant dem var det også en nordmann.
H.P. Faye arrived here in 1880 with the intention of farming on his uncle's land, farming sugarcane. And when he arrived, due to the slow state of the mails, apparently his uncle, who had invited him to come down here, decided to take his family on a tour around the world, so they weren't here. And his cousin Anton was growing cane at Kekaha, but because his uncle wasn't here, he couldn't make any formal arrangements. So he had gone to Maui for a short time and grown cane with his brother-in-law, and then worked for 2 years with the Gay and Robinson out in Hanapepe. So in that course, he didn't waste his time. He learned how to grow sugarcane and all the technology behind it, and was very proud of his accomplishments. And so when his uncle came back in 1884, he leased the last piece of land that his uncle had available down on this plain, which is out here, and this area here is called Mana. And it was a sizable Hawaiian village. These foothills that you see behind here, they actually have a lot of water, and it came out in springs. And so wherever the springs were, there was a little Hawaiian village. And also there were 3 very large swampy areas, which they used to call lakes out here. And one of them was right behind us over on this side here toward the ocean, and it was called Limaloa. And a rice farmer had come in the 1860s and leased land from the uncle, and he was growing rice and had already started to import men to work for him. He had nearly 200 Chinese laborers that worked for him. So when HP came here, he had probably the worst piece of land down here in Kekaha. He had the swamps on one side. He had a lot of rocky land here, which of course after 100 years is nice and clean, but at the time was very rocky. And he also, but he was lucky in that he had labor here, whereas most people started with no labor. And he had the Hawaiians that worked in the village or lived in the village, and then also these Chinese men, which he rented from the rice farmer, Pa'an Leong. And so first thing he did was he needed to get money to get started because he didn't have any cash in his pockets. And his father had sent him from Norway with a trunk full of clothes. He had sent him to his tailor, and he said, you're not going to have an opportunity to this is a good thing for me to give you. I don't have much to give you. And so he rooted around in his trunk, and he found a suit that had, pinstripe, looked like his banker's suit, he said. and he went to Honolulu, and he went to one of the sugar factors. At the time, it was Hackfeld and Company, and he went to meet Paul Eisenberg, who was the owner of one of the owners of the sugar mill here in Kekaha. And he walked into the office, and he didn't even have to beg for money, which he thought he was going to have to do. He was actually, Paul Eisenberg was so impressed by his suit and his appearance and whatnot that he immediately loaned him the money he needed to get started. And he had to borrow enough money to stake himself for about 2 years, because he had to buy the building materials to build his houses, to harvest the cane, to the cane stalks to get started as far as planting and everything. So it was about $2,000 at that time. So in 1884, that was quite a bit of money. H.P. Faye built his home. Actually, you're looking at, there's one, two, the third valley over there. There's a bunch of trees over in the distance there. And he could sit on his verandas and pretty much oversee the whole plantation. And
so how did they choose the location of these places? Faye here in this place and Knudsen over there?
It was all had to do with water, because otherwise you'd have to transport the water. So the spring was right there. So his house was also the office. I mean, very simple. He came as a young man, a single man. His expectations were to make his fortune and then marry and have children and, retire. I mean, that was typically the mentality of most of the men coming here. And he's just one of the few that actually stayed. Even of all his relatives, he stayed here. He enjoyed the work. His day would begin, with before the sunlight, and they'd be coming in as it was getting dark. They usually came in during at the lunch hour, and then they would sit on their verandas and probably confer, what they were going to do for the afternoon or even for the next day. And then there was a cookhouse, I guess, and then about 4 houses around there. Of course, in the very earliest day, he didn't have to. I think he had some barracks, but he didn't really have to provide housing for most of his laborers, since the rice farmer already had put in barracks for his men, and the Hawaiians had their own houses. It was later, as the plantation grew, then of course they had the imported labor coming in from other countries. So the labor came from as many as 13 different countries. You had, from Europe, from South Pacific, and also Asia, and different waves of immigration. He was here pretty much by himself for nearly 10 years. But he had a few Norwegians that came to work with him. It wasn't a lot of people. I mean, it was just very, so you had a lot of Chinese people. You had a lot of Hawaiian people. He spoke Hawaiian fluently. He spent time with, what leisure time he had, he spent with some of these Hawaiian people, and they took him fishing. And even when the children were young, they would take them out fishing and teaching them all about their lives and how they did things. So, very close relationship. So they were all, because there wasn't a lot of Norwegians here, he would socialize he'd visit his uncle Valdemar, who was maybe about 4 miles down the way. Maybe go to dinner at his house or something like that. But really, he wasn't doing a lot of socializing in his early days. If he took time off, it'd probably be during the winter months, and then he might go and stay with some friends in Waimea and spend a few days there or something like that. But during the harvest season, he'd be here in his fields. So then, about 1892, I think he got married, and then his life changed it was very different. His house, because of its remoteness, I mean, for a while it was used by the division head that was located in this area. And that house was, and then it was being made into a supervisor's clubhouse, because they could have wild parties out there and not bother anybody. But eventually we brought the house down to Waimea, and it's used for the lobby for Waimea Plantation cottages there. Valdemar Knudsen had in these land leases, and it wasn't just a financial relationship. He leased this he bought out the lease from another Norwegian named Archer. who was growing tobacco out here. And the tobacco crop had failed, and he wanted to get out of it. So he made his new Norwegian friend, Valdemar Knutsen, an offer. And so for 2,000 a year, he had the lands at Kekaha all the way through here down to 2 valleys down into the Nambali coast called Miloli, up to Koke, this huge piece of land here. And it was actually made up of a number of ahupua'as, which are the traditional land divisions of the Hawaiians, where you have the resources of the mountains, you have enough water, and then of course crop growing land to pay your taxes. Your taxes were in product. As a leaseholder, you were the of one of these ahupua'a, or this is actually a much larger piece. You were considered to be a konohiki chief, and that means you were like the overseer of the area. So you were supposed to collect the taxes. You were responsible for all the welfare of all the people living here, and they didn't have to stay there or anything of that nature. So it was really, if they liked you, they'd stay, and there was money, or a living to be made, they'd stay here. So all of these people here, of course, predated him, the villages and everything like that. He really, he employed them as a konohiki chief, because they lived on the land. Basically, their rent was for so many days out of the year or a month, say maybe 4 days or so, they would be required to provide some labor. So that he could have fences put in or whatever. As far as employing people full time, they didn't have any need for money. Everything was bartered. They grew everything that they needed to exist. So the only reason they would work for a family full time was usually because they were attached to them. They liked them. So there were individuals that were very loyal to the family, became like family retainers, took care of the children and whatnot. Because you were going everywhere by horseback, a lot of them, and a lot of the Hawaiians had an affinity with the animals, and they were very good with them. So they would be a lot of times we would call them cowboys. They would just take care of the moving the family around, driving them, riding with them, accompanying the children when they were riding around. So, and then of course taking care of the livestock and things or doing whatever chores the family wanted them to do. They would be paid, but they weren't there because of the money. So it was more of a loyalty. These pieces of land seem really enormous today, but it was because you could produce very little on the property because of not having enough water. Traditionally, your resources here, they used to grow taro in the swamps, but out where you see this white over here, that's actually where Barking Sands is, and the ocean is just beyond there. There were fishing villages. This was actually a famous area for fishing. And so the product was basically dried fish, and they would trade it with the other Hawaiians for taro because they didn't grow that much here. In fact, there was an old Hawaiian saying where they said that the Hawaiians at Mana never cooked their own food because they traded actually in cooked food. So they dried the fish and then they would be given poi in return. It's just that the fact that they had the springs in this area here, that they were able to grow sugarcane at all because it needs a lot of water. So Valdemar was raising cattle, so he didn't need a lot of water. But he did introduce a lot of what today we would call invasive plant species to the area for cattle feed. One of them was the kiawe tree, which is also called mesquite in the southwest United States. It's a very, the seed pods can be eaten by the cattle. It's very rich, nutritious food, if you have a drought or something like that. We're looking at very green mountains here, and that's because we had an enormous, almost 10 inches of rain about 3 weeks ago. So it's very nice and green, but normally it's very brown. And then we have a plant called halikoa. There's a bunch of them right there. It's a shrub there that has the brown seed pods. That can live in almost the dry, most arid conditions. They also introduced a cactus called panini. It's a prickly pear, I guess is another name for it. And the cattle can eat that for water as well. All these plants were introduced to Niihau as well in most of the Hawaiian Islands. So you could, basically you could let your cattle roam, and then they round them up, and but you didn't have to have grassland so much to support the cattle. So the cattle actually were run in these valleys until fairly recently, until the 80s. Ranching was a big industry here in Hawaii for a long time, but starting about 1830. We had actually cattle ranches and cowboys here before the western part of the United States did. All the technology for raising cattle came from Mexico, including the cattle came from Mexico. Their principal market at the time was whaling ships and trading ships that used to come through here. Kauai was actually known more for its dairies. Had a lot of dairies. They would keg the butter and put it into barrels, and that was taken because when you're working up in the north, I guess you need to eat a lot of fat to keep warm, and so the butter, that was what the butter was used for. So most of there weren't a lot of people in Hawaii for a long time too. They really came in with the sugar industry. By about 1850, what little sugar industry there was at the time had exhausted the labor supply in the islands. You know, your Hawaiians. So then they started bringing in people from different countries to come and work on the sugar plantations, and the labor was needed because the Hawaiian sugar industry, and any sugar industry requires a lot of labor. The harvesting season was very long. It was nearly 10 months out of the year, so it'd be done during the hottest times of the year, the spring, summer, fall. And then you have a rainy season, usually during the winter months. That was actually repair and maintenance. So because they were bringing in immigrants from other countries, they had to provide work for them year-round, otherwise they couldn't keep them. And so typically they came on 3-year contracts because the plantations wanted to make sure they got their investment for bringing them over paid back eventually, and also putting in housing and everything for them. The Hawaiian Kingdom was heavily involved in the sugar industry because it was the main source of export money, or money coming into the Hawaiian Islands at the time. And they were very concerned at the small Hawaiian population, and they controlled the immigration in the sense that as long as not too many people came in from any one place. So because they were always fearful that there would be enough coming in to take over the government. And eventually that's what happened. There were too many Americans in prominent government positions.
H.P. Faye was he was an industrious man,
Very
and
industrious.
innovative in many ways.
He had to be. He had the worst piece of land here for sugar production. What happened was in the early days they were pumping water. Sugar cane requires a lot of water, so they were pumping water from those springs, and using simple ditches, bringing the water down, because basically it slopes down like this. And they were it's like you have to have, it's the economy of scale. So of course in the early days all they're doing is putting a crop in the ground, harvesting it, reinvesting the money. They're not really making any money. All they're doing is reinvesting, and trying to grow it to a point where they're actually going to make enough money off of it. And so they were putting in irrigation to take care of these fields, but it was finite because you had these big swamps over here. Eventually what happened, they needed more water than came from these springs, and there's water directly below the ground. What it is because this was there's actually seawater. I guess it goes all the way up to the cliffs there, which actually go into the ground. This was actually once a barrier reef, so it's just filled in with silt. So there's salt water underneath here, and then there's a fresh water that sits on top of it. And what they were doing was pumping this fresh water up out of the ground with artesian wells. And eventually they brought the saltwater table up, and it hit the roots of the cane. So then all of a sudden they weren't getting very good harvests. Your harvests were measured by how much tons of sugar you got per acre. And so it was drastically reduced. So that meant their profits went down. And they had to think of a way to bring fresh water here. And this area here, the rainfall average is about 18 inches of rain a year, very little water. And the nearest source of a steady water supply, fresh water supply, is Waimea River, which is nearly 10 miles in that direction. And so they had to figure out a way to bring that water here. By 1898, this was starting to occur about the time when they decided to consolidate all the growers and the factory owner into Kekaha Sugar. So that's the year of Hawaii becoming a territory of the United States. And this was all incorporated under U.S. law as Kekaha Sugar. company. So formally it's incorporated in 1898. And H.P. Faye then moves his house, his family, and most of his operations down to Kekaha. So that's when they settled at Poki'i in the old Meyer estate. At the time of incorporation, Myers was took his money from the when they did the consolidation and decided to retire. He was a German man that was working at that side, and so H.P. Faye moved into it, and his house was actually almost identical to the one he had here. So there wasn't, in the photographs, the only reason you know the difference is because the railings look different in the pictures. And then you see all the, improvements during the early 1900s. You saw all the steam plows, the trains, all of that infrastructure going in. So it was a great deal of capital that was invested, to make the plantation, improve the plantation. And from 1898, Kekaha Sugar was a stock company, so at that point, you're trying to pay your investors and whatnot. It was really, I think, later when his first, he had his first five of 8 children, that he decided to go back to Norway was when he was starting to think about retiring, and it was his first he calls it his first vacation that he ever had from the time he came here in 1880. So
when was that?
That was in about 1902, 1903, when you saw those photographs of them in Norway. They made a short visit back, and that's really his major, and they were there for, I think, 2 years. They took all the children with them. And then he came back. At that time, they were starting to develop that ditch system from Waimea River. So, he had to get this plantation kind of on an even keel, so they needed to bring in that fresh water. And about that same time, then he bought Waimea Sugar as well, and that was to ensure that he had the right of way for the trains and also for the water to come out here to all the way out to Polihali, actually. At that point, then he decided to retire, and he was still nominally, he was still considered the manager of Kekaha Sugar actually until he died, but then there were actual operators, managers. They would be called the assistant manager, but they were actually the managers of Kekaha Sugar. One man, E.K. Bull, Edward Kraft Bull, was actually a close associate with him. He came here in the early days, and then he worked for the Sinclair family on Niihau, and then he worked at Waipahu Sugar, and then he was assistant manager under my great-grandfather when he went to Norway on that first trip, so he was taking care of the plantation here. Eventually he retired back in Norway. But H.P., I don't know, he was just always, I guess, he loved doing things, keeping busy, and even when he was trying to retire, he always sort of seemed to have his hand in here. And of course, the mails were slow, but they still got to him, and every time they had a crisis on the plantation here, they called him back in, and so he had to come back. And
so he remained a manager here, and then they moved to the Montebello family house in Norway, stayed there for a couple of years, and moved on to Berkeley.
Yeah, they stayed, I guess. 2 decisions, one, I don't think they were really happy there. I think it was very provincial. It was, and then of course I guess they were feeling like the unsettledness of the war. There was going to be some problems, so they kind of left just before World War I started, and his wife didn't want to move back here, so they went up to Berkeley, and you ask maybe why Berkeley, but that's where like a lot of the Hawaiian sugar plantation people were settling, and so it was a very ritzy area. San Francisco was very close by, so they were like in the hills above San Francisco, and actually the house that they built, Margaret Lindsay, his wife, lived there until she died. So she enjoyed society and doing all of those things, and I think it bored him. So he did what he had to, but then he started playing around. I guess there were draining swamps in Sacramento, so he went over and played over there and bought some land. Got involved financially in some farming over there. And because it was similar, the land was sort of similar to here, he actually bought a lot of the used equipment and brought it down here, and then they started draining the swamps here as well. So he was always, you know, I think thinking about his plantation as he was sort of supposed to be in retirement.
But then your grandfather decided to come back here from Berkeley and
Well,
take over.
yeah, actually, you know, even though my great-grandfather was trying to retire, all his financial interests were still here. He didn't sell out or anything, which is why he was still manager at Kauai Sugar. He still had a great deal of stock in the company. Well, the sons were finally coming of age, and you know, they had gone to preparatory academy, Choate in New England, and then he'd gone to Yale and all that kind of thing. The oldest son was put in a position that was then AmFac by that time, the old Hackfeld and Company, and you know, to kind of work his way up the ranks. And my grandfather was the next oldest son, so he was tested at Waimea, you know, to see, you know, sort of trained to fill in his father's shoes at Kekaha. Kekaha was the source of the family's wealth. Waimea Sugar was a very small little sugar plantation. And, you know, all the sons were kind of given or entryway into jobs, and you know, to become managers of sugar plantations. And, you know, some of them took advantage of, or did well in it, and some didn't. But my grandfather was the one who was put in at Kekaha. Alan Faya was put in at Waimea Sugar. So my grandfather was actually manager of Kekaha Sugar from 1938 or 1936 to 1963, which was a very long time period. And then his brother Alan was manager from 1929 to 1969 when he died, 68 when he died, over at Waimea Sugar. So the two brothers were actually side by side. So they were really the only two that were living here all along. That were kind of here. And for a time, HP was living here when they were building the Coquet Ditch. And he was sort of like, I think he had his finger on what was going on and kind of in control of it, but he was also playing over in Waimea, moving their houses around and kind of setting up his plantation there the way he liked it. So he was kind of having a lot of fun there. He had bought the land there at Waimea on the ocean, hoping that his wife would find it cool enough an area to live, because there's a nice breeze there. It's, you know, very warm in areas like this. I mean, we're here in the winter, so this is the most pleasant time of year to be out here. But during the summer, it can be very warm.